Hi, let's talk about activities and intents in Android applications. An activity is what we call a single unit of user interaction within an Android application. So whenever the user is interacting with an Android application, they are doing so through one or more activities. Activities are made up of several parts. They will first have a subclass of the activity class, or I should say one of its subclasses. There's some subclasses such as list activity and so forth. But basically it is a subclass of the activity class. It can also consist of an XML file describing the layout of the controls. Now we can think of, in the context of Model View Controller, we can think of an activity itself, the activity class, as the controller of a view, and the XML file as the view itself. And then there will be other files that are bound to this activity, such as strings, images, and so forth, and these are in resources. The layout of the activity, the XML file, is actually a resource of the activity, and it's loaded up on Create in any activity that we want to display. Activities also must be listed in the Android manifest file for each application. Each activity that we use within a single application must be listed out in the Android manifest file. So we have an activity idea. What is an intent? Well, intent is declaring the intention to perform some work. We have the ability with an intent to start a new activity. We can start a service, which we haven't talked about yet, but a service is an object that allows us to perform work in the background or in another thread. We cannot start a content provider through an intent. We do that through something else, content resolver. And we'll talk about that in Chapter 5, I believe. But strike the third thing. The starting a content provider, this is not true. We cannot start a content provider through an intent. Intents can start a process within the application, or they can start a process from another application, as long as we have the proper intent filter for those processes within the target application. And all application components, along with their intent filters, have to be listed in the Android manifest file. Intents sound a little formidable, but actually they're very simple. To start a new activity using an intent, use the following form. So we declare an intent, and here we're declaring an object called myIntent that is of type intent. We say new intent, and we have the intent constructor, and intent has many forms of constructor, but the simplest one is the activity we are coming from and the activity we are going to. And then we call start activity with the new intent, and that will actually start the activity and display it. And that activity will have its own life cycle, which works along with the original activity's life cycle. An intent can also contain extras, and these are fields that the new activity might need to properly initialize data or use data from the first activity. So what about these intent extras? Well, these extras are key value pairs. Now, don't get all hung up on what a key value pair is. They have a key, which is a string, and they have a value, which can be of any type. So the keys are strings, the values can be of any type. We can put an extra into myIntent. We have an extra called name. We have an extra called age. The name extra will refer to it by the string NAME, or name, and then it is Mary Jones. We have a string, Mary Jones. We can put an age extra, and her age is 35, and this is a number of some kind. So we might read that number as an int, we might read it as a float. That doesn't matter. That's on the other end when we get the extras. And then in the target activity, we're going to get the extras. So here we have a new activity, extending activity. We've set up two private properties, the string for a name and the int for an age. And then in onCreate, we pull the extras by using this dot, getIntent dot, getExtras dot, getString, and then we use the key, and that will give us back the value. Whoops. Okay, so in an activity, in the XML file, we have a number of attributes. And the most important one, if we want to use a control or source it in our activity code, it needs to define an Android ID attribute in its layout XML file. There's going to be two forms. One has a plus before ID, and one has no plus before ID. It's just at ID. Plus will create that ID if it doesn't exist. Without the plus, it assumes there is already an existing ID with that name. Always use the plus form. It just makes more sense. In other words, the ID is not going to be created if it doesn't already exist. So always use at plus ID slash and then the name of the ID. These are integers, and they will be defined in a file called r.java. r.java is nothing. We can look at it, but we can never modify it. It will be modified for us as we create these IDs. So in code, we can attach a property or a local variable to an ID using a method called findViewById, and we resolve these IDs using r.id and then the name that we give them. So findViewById takes a single parameter, which is the fully qualified ID of the view being sourced, which is what I just talked about. So if we have a myText ID, then findViewById r.id.myText is going to return the control, or the integer value of the control having Android ID plus ID myText. That control will be returned as type view. In other words, all of these controls are of type view, so the control itself is going to be returned as a view type, and it has to be cast. So if myText is a text view, then we have to cast it. We cast the result of findViewById to a text view in order to assign it to a text view, as we've done here. So let's have a short quiz. First of all activities are started using a or an blank. Is it a button, Android manifest, intent, or intent filter? Second question. Activities must be registered in the blank file within any application that uses them. Is it the layout XML file, the mainActivity.java file, r.java, or Android manifest? Question 3. There are some errors in this activity, and it gets extras from its intent. So we want to look for the extras in this activity. What are the errors in this code that will break it so that it doesn't work? And finally, question 4. Assume an app has two activities, main activity and second activity. When second activity loads, it only covers a portion of main activity. In other words, physically, it only covers a portion of the screen, and main activity is still partially visible in the background. In what state will main activity be in while second activity is visible? Will it be started, resumed, paused, or stopped?